Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for the opportunity to be together with all of you. I wish I could see your faces more fully than I can at the moment, but I'm grateful for the chance to just share a little bit of reflection together and then perhaps have some conversation. I can only imagine what you're feeling. I think the people that I seem to be having contact with these days, both at the seminary and in many other places, are feelings of being scattered, feelings of being isolated, feelings of being disoriented, people who are experiencing fear and anxiety, who are already completely over the isolation and are eager to get back, and others who are feeling sort of like this is the new norm that they actually have always wanted with their lives because they are perhaps introverts and just love the isolation of it all. So I don't know what you're feeling, but I'm sure there's a lot that's going on. And certainly what I want to reflect on a little bit tonight has to do with what does God help say to us in times like this. I think the most dramatic instance of this in the Bible is probably the second great paradigm of the Old Testament. If the first one is the Exodus, the second great paradigm is the paradigm of the exile. The scatteredness, the loneliness, the isolation, the sense of confusion, of fear, of anxiety, of danger, of loss. Oh my gosh, all of those things were part of Israel's being moved by God from the Holy Land, as we call it, from Jerusalem and the land of Israel into Babylonian rule. And the book of Daniel is one of the main books that captures that. So let me just make three brief observations, and then I hope we can connect those to what we're all feeling right now. What happens in Daniel is that the exile that unfolds is not really an exile that comes about just because of Babylon's power. It happens because of God's act of discipline. It's an act of spiritual discipline to say, what happens, people of God, when I take you away from your land, away from everything that you take as the ground of your security, all of the signs of your worshiping life, if I take you away from places where there's special vessels for the temple and special sacrificial systems that are in place, and I take away your leadership and I remove you from the circumstances in which you've been grounded. And I put you in isolation, in exile, under the dominating power of the day, Babylon. And I now ask you, now who do you really trust? It's a riveting, understated moment at the very start of the book of Daniel. And it's all captured in one paragraph. And as this all happens, then what unfolds in the book of Daniel is really framed by the question, what happens when everything that we took for granted as the ground of our spiritual life and our national life and our spiritual life and our personal family, religious life and so forth is all suddenly upended. So what happens is that in the first chapter of Daniel, there's the question is really, who are you when everything you think defines you is taken away? That's the great question of the first chapter. And Daniel and his friends decide fairly quickly that they need to maintain a pattern of remembering who they are. And what unfolds in that chapter is a test that has to do with how they're going to observe the dietary law. But it's not really about the dietary law. It's really about how do they remember who they are. And the dietary law was always meant to be a remembrance that God was their provider, that God was the one who fed them in the wilderness, that God was the one who brought them into the promised land, and that God is the one who's now actually brought them even into Babylon. And now the question is, who are they when they're stripped of everything that they thought they knew for sure? No temple, no holy land, no sacred rites, no leadership, except now these pagan rulers and forces. So in a time like this that we're facing, I think the first question up undoubtedly is one really of our identity. I'm aware from conversations I've had with professors and with graduate students in many, many different universities that so much of our work and research and productivity and achievement is all oriented to what can happen in the lab or what can happen when we have easier access to all the materials that define us, and what happens when all of that is now curtailed or threatened or in any case disrupted. So the question that the first chapter of Daniel raises about worship in exile is really the question, who are we and who is the God that actually defines us? they decide that they're going to observe the dietary law. I don't think that the New Testament suggests that we should keep the dietary law in the way that Israel did, but I do think the New Testament does ask us through the ministry of Jesus, who do we really think we are? To whom do we belong? And what are the practices of daily life? The really ordinary practices when we, yes, sit down at a table and eat food, or when we pray, or when we remember, or when we ponder, or when we create a space of practice that helps us remember our identity. That's not about our personal productivity or being in Jerusalem, but is really about who we are in relationship to the God who still calls us and loves us and knows us, even now in exile. Exile is meant to be a time of clearing out the confusion and getting back to first things. So the first thing I want to just ask us, and as we think about what our worship means in exile, is how do we really remember who we are? What are our practices? The second chapter moves in a really different direction. What happens is that Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler, who's a megalomaniac and a rageaholic, ends up creating a test that's driven out of his own fear. And he comes to the soothsayers of the day and demands that they tell him a dream that he had that had been terrifying, what the dream was and what it meant. And they explain, no, Nebuchadnezzar, the way it works is that you first tell us the dream and then we'll tell you what it means. And he says, no, actually what this is about is I'm so desperate this time. I don't want any palather. I don't want you to give me any sideshow. I want you to actually demonstrate that you have real spiritual authority. So tell me the dream and then tell me the interpretation. This creates a crisis. Daniel steps in. He and his friends go to God in prayer. They cry out. They say that no one anywhere could possibly do this. He set an impossible test. But would God please give them insight? Because this is the God who raises up kings and lowers kings. This is the God who created the heavens and the earth. This is the God who holds all authority and power. Please, oh God, give us insight into this. God does give that insight. And then there's this wonderful section where they remember to worship God before they go back to try to save their necks with Nebuchadnezzar. They bow down, they pray, they call out to the God that they know is really the one that's provided this. They don't see this as personal, a point of personal pride. They want to bow in humility before God, but they want to give praise for an act that only God could do. Only God could give them an understanding of the dream and its meaning. And it was a terrifying dream. No wonder Nebuchadnezzar was scared. And they have to go back and tell him terrifying news, namely that his kingdom is on the way to crumbling. And so having asked for God having delivered, they acknowledge and bow down, not to Nebuchadnezzar, but really to the God who had provided this. So they go back, they tell Nebuchadnezzar, and amazingly, Nebuchadnezzar is so spiritually hungry for a real, authentic word that when they come back and they tell him, in a way, the worst interpretation of the dream, that this is the beginning of the end of your kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar falls down and thanks them, is so grateful for them, even in a kind of direct, indirect way, praises the God who provided this. And they say, no. It was, don't get any confusion. We were not the ones who provided it. It was the God that we worship. This is who actually provided it. They don't point toward themselves, though they might have been prone to do that because it might have saved their neck more easily. But they tell the threatening king the most dangerous news on the grounds that God is with them in this dream and in this moment of exile. So I think of the first chapter of Daniel is really about how do we remember who we are? That's the central question of the exile. The next question becomes, what is the character of the God that we're worshiping? And how do we believe God for something that isn't under our control? So often right now what's happening, of course, with COVID-19 is a completely understandable desire to get everything back under our control. It's part of the appeal, actually, of even isolation and staying at home, is that it gives us some small measure of control before something that we can't see, can't track, don't yet fully understand. But interestingly, in Daniel 2, it's really trying to strip Daniel and his friends of any illusion that they have under any control. They can't produce the knowledge that Nebuchadnezzar is demanding. I think we have to ask ourselves if we're really, in the end, seeking God, or whether we're in the end really seeking our own comfort, our own control, our own assurance. Exile strips a lot of that away. It causes us to have to face our fears, to lament, to grieve. All of that is part of this exilic season. So the first question is, who are we? Second question is, who is the God that we're trusting? And do we believe God for something that is beyond our capacity, but really truly a gift that only God could provide? What is it in this season that we want to trust God for in our worship and in our life? Then the third chapter of Daniel is another very interesting chapter. What happens is that Nebuchadnezzar builds the image that was the core of the nightmare of chapter 2. It's a towering kind of idol, really. And in doing all this, Nebuchadnezzar is trying to take control of the image of his nightmare. But what happens is that then he announces to everyone that everyone in the whole kingdom should bow down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And in his usual rageaholic way, he asserts all of his dominating power and says anyone and everyone needs to do this, and if they don't, they'll be thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Well, it comes along to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they don't bow down. And some of the people whose necks they had saved in chapter 2 are the people that rat them out to Nebuchadnezzar. And he comes after them and says, is it true that you won't bow down to the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up? And all of what's woven through chapter 3 is the repetition of some music that says, and then when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, an entire musical ensemble, you shall bow down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And that refrain occurs again and again and again with all of that list. It's what I've thought of as the mesmerizing rhythms of idolatry. You only need to hear the cue, the social cue, the musical cue, the emotional cue, the desperation cue, the control cue, to say, just do this and you'll be fine. And sure enough, everyone bows down except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar confronts them. Why won't you bow down? They refuse to bow down. He says, but who is it on the whole earth that could possibly deliver you from my hands? Who is the God even, he says, who could deliver you from my hands? And they say, look, our God could deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So it's the most powerful part of that chapter. In the end, they're saved from the fire. That's not actually the climax of chapter 3. The climax of chapter 3, theologically speaking, is this moment where they refuse to bow down. Even if he doesn't, we refuse to get our worship wrong, because they realized that there was a greater and lesser danger. Nebuchadnezzar was convinced that his authority and power and anger and the fire were the greatest danger. But to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the greater danger was false worship and ultimately even idolatry. So a third question that I think we can think about as exiles living our worship is not only who we are, not only what are we trusting God for that's beyond ourselves, but thirdly, can we distinguish the greater and lesser danger? Right now, every newspaper, every feed that I look at is filled with threats or implicit threats of dangers. And a whole person could completely exhaust their life trying to make sure that they're trying to avoid every possible danger. But in this case, what happens is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego give us a witness for what exilic worship looks like. It looks like walking into reality, naming it as it is. You, Nebuchadnezzar, think that you have all power and authority. You really don't. And the greater danger is not what you can do to us or our bodies. The greater danger is that we would worship a false god, and we refuse to do that. So these 3 chapters, I want to suggest as we move to some conversation together, these 3 chapters to me are extremely provocative because they set up the terms for really asking ourselves anew, what is it that really grounds us in the middle of such a time of disorientation, when all the things that we turn to and depend on are in so many cases stripped away? Who are we? For what are we trusting God? And can we distinguish the greater dangers from the lesser dangers and be sure that we refuse to bow down to anyone or anything but God alone? So let me pause there. I have a couple more things I want to say, but those three things to me define what exilic worship is about. And I'd love to hear any thoughts, reactions, tomatoes, questions that you might have that you want to raise in response to what I just shared.
I can also go first to get the conversation rolling if I don't see any question in the chat yet. So thank you so much for this talk. I have to say one of the reasons we didn't interrupt to ask you to turn your screen was just didn't want to interrupt how great the talk.
Well, that's very kind. Thanks.
I think one thing that stood out to me was this idea of Nebuchadnezzar making a statue as part of his attempts to assert control over something that had given him a lot of fear before. And I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that and to ways in which people try to use mechanisms other than turning to God to assert control over fear.
Yeah, I think it happens in endless cases, right? Our test results, our lab tests, the preeminence of the institutions we attend, et cetera, all of that can be its own version of idol making, right? I mean, this is the stuff of any sort of elitism that can substitute for God. So the danger of those things is not that they aren't deserving of due honor and respect and of the benefit that they bring, as long as we're clear that they are not sufficient as an explanation for an understanding of our life, of our value, of the meaning of who we are. It's not true that our life is more meaningful because of the institution we attend, or because of the job that we have, or because of the title that we occupy, or because of an achievement that we have. We can be grateful for all those things, and all those things are tools, but they can also be extraordinarily powerful distractions from what I would say the Bible considers to be first order priorities, which really has to do with really who are we in our essence, not just in our activity. So I think our activity is included in that, but not our power. I think what happens in the text in Daniel is this amazing sense that the terrifying image of the dream for Nebuchadnezzar was this tower. And at the top was gold, and at the bottom was stubble. And it was a story, as Daniel and his friends explained, it was a story of a kingdom that has a bad foundation and is going to fall. That was Nebuchadnezzar's nightmare. He had all authority, but he believed that in a way, this tower represented his undoing. But if I can make the tower and make everyone bow down to the tower, then it creates a different, a really different way of understanding the meaning of our lives and the meaning of our activity. And but I think in Nebuchadnezzar's case, it was trying to get control of all that rather than realizing he himself was inadequate. So by the time you get to chapter 4 of Daniel, it is the undoing of Nebuchadnezzar himself. He literally has a psychological breakdown. All of his underlying pathologies are exposed. And one of the things that happens, I think, in a time like this for all of us, we all have pathologies of different kinds. We all have fears and anxieties and uncertainties. We are more fearful than we would ever normally let on. And yet, we try to control our fears by our achievements, for example, or whatever. Ultimately, that never is sufficient. And suddenly, when a time like COVID-19 arrives, it exposes that. I hope that makes it maybe a little more clear what I was trying to say.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really helpful. And now we have Chris on the line with the next question.
Okay.
Feel free to, Chris, feel free to share a question out loud. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much. So my question is, I wrote it in the chat, your 3 really excellent questions sound like worldview questions to me. Who am I? Where am I? What's wrong? What's the remedy? So would you say Exile brings a worldview shift, like
it does,
a period of disorientation,
yes,
or clarifies and or reaffirms their worldview reorientation, or maybe both? Right.
I think that is what happens, and I can say it's a profound experience to me to work with recent immigrants to the United States, which I've done off and on over many years. And one of the things that happens is that they are in their own space, maybe not necessarily in a spiritual exile, but they are absolutely in a personal exile. And I know, also having lived a couple of times overseas and having traveled in places for long enough periods of time, that I'm unable to read the clues of what's really going on. Probably the place that leaves me the most baffled still is India, where despite many trips there, I mostly feel disoriented from the moment I land to the moment I leave. And it does bring these questions into mind. How do I even understand who I am in this ocean of people, and what's going on, and how do I get my bearings, and how would I understand what's important here, and to what do I want to respond, and to what do I want to disengage, right? All those questions. So yes, I do think they are worldview questions, and I do think that they raise what I think are just first order questions about our lives.
Thank you.
Sure. Unfortunately, what can also do is, and this is, if I had longer, I would have teased this out further. In chapter 1, Daniel and his friends are given a new language, new names, new literature, a whole new educational opportunity, new authority. And the whole idea is assimilation, right? Not worldview consideration, but assimilate to Babylon. And we are living in an assimilationist mode right now. It's part of what social media has certainly become, and it exists in every other form of life around us as well. Endless assimilation. So the greater danger, in this case, the greater danger is that we could actually assimilate, and in that lose our identity, lose our understanding of who God is, lose our understanding of what really matters and what really are the dangers. And sadly, I've seen that happen in at times and seasons, even in my own life, but also in the lives of other people that I've loved, who go in and out of a knowledge of God and a knowledge of themselves and a knowledge of the world. So I don't think this is only a political or medical reality. I think it is a psychological experience over and over again.
Thank you, and thank you, Chris. I think next question is, oh, I'm sorry, Chris, did you want to clarify anything before we go to the next question?
No, that's good. Thanks.
Oh.
Thanks, Chris.
And then next up, So Young with a question on idolatry. So her question is, idol worship is easy and simple. There is a ritual, a social cue, and then by doing that, you're promised or put into a framework in which you believe that everything will be fine. We also believe that when we worship God, everything will be fine. So like for people who may be new to approaching these ideas of different types of gods, or seeing many possible ways to go to find security and comfort, how do they earn, I guess, discernment between idolatry versus the ritual and habits that lead us to God?
Yeah. It's a really important question, and a very complicated question actually to sort out, because it's really the question of how do we understand what it means to come to a knowledge of God? What is our epistemology about God? How might it be that we could imagine a claim to genuine knowledge of God, albeit through faith? But we would not say it's as it were mere faith. We would claim that it's a kind of theological knowing. It's not certainty, hence it's faith, but it is genuine knowing, just a different kind of knowing. So it's not a scientific knowing. It's not a knowing that has to do with facts and figures, but it is a knowing that is a spiritual knowing that's based on the witness of the Bible. It's based on the witness of the Holy Spirit at work in our lives. It's a witness based on the testimony and signs of the history of the church and of the living church that may surround us, right? All that is, those are all discernment tools to be able to help us figure out whether we think God is knowable, whether there is a God, whether God is knowable, and if so, how God becomes knowable. So that's an enormously important question, but it is enormous, so I can't address it in its entirety, of course. But I would just say, when people are living in a pluralistic, a religiously pluralistic world, and where there's all kinds of religious truth claims, then in my view, they are reality claims, and the reality is the character and nature of God, if there is a God, and what would be the means by which we would come to that? And then how do we place that journey as it might intersect with the Christian faith and its particular view alongside other views? So I wouldn't myself say, for example, in light of the framing of the question, that that other religions say follow this way and things will turn out okay. I don't think that's what Jesus taught. I think Jesus said, follow this way and you will lose your life. It's a very, very different narrative. That's part of what you have to test. Is that part of what authenticates or de-authenticates the gospel? I have to say, from my point of view, it's what authenticates the gospel, because it's not a kind of promise of, if you do this, everything will turn out rosy. There are some Christian presentations or caricatures of the Christian faith that I think represent that. And in the end, God will bring about our shalom, our well-being, our wholeness, but in life in this time frame, we are not promised any sense that all will turn out well. We're promised that God will be with us in the process of seeking to follow him, and it will involve laying down our lives. That's a really different point of comparison. And I think often in context of multi-faith discussions that I've had over the years, that's one of the more arresting claims that's actually quite central to the teaching of Jesus. So I think we have to explore that. That's peculiar, right? That makes its own odd claim. So what do we make of that? How would we understand that? Especially when we know a lot of people would say that what they're looking for is just for everything in their life to turn out all right. Well, unfortunately, Jesus is after something more complicated and richer than that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I'll make sure that Soyeon gets a recording of this so that she
Sure.
hears the answer. And I think next up is Joe. Do you want to go with your question?
Yeah, thank you so much again. It's kind of a somewhat related question about idolatry, but kind of more like idolatry in like the secular sense of wanting to worship things that are things that we can't necessarily abandon, something like work or like family, things that are
Right.
are things that we can't just walk away from. It's not like worshiping an idol. So what are some like metrics or indicators that we have disordered priorities?
Yeah. I like your use of that phrase, disordered, because it was Augustine who said that sin is really disordered love. And the same thing is true, of course, about idolatries, right? It's not that the things that you mentioned, for example, family and work and so forth, are inherently idolatrous. I don't think that's true. And in that sense, I think what we're called to is love, which is really very different than worship. I can love something very deeply and passionately and importantly even, but that's really different than making it the first and defining allegiance of my life, before which I am alone meant to truly offer myself, as Paul says in Romans 12:1, as a living sacrifice. If I'm offering myself as a living sacrifice to my family, I think there's a good chance that I'm going down the wrong road, that I'm giving my family a priority that is of a supreme and unchecked kind. I don't think I'm ever called to worship something human, including my family. I'm certainly not meant to worship my work. This is why Sabbath practice is so critical, because we do our work, but then we lay down our implements of work. And we do so remembering that none of this belongs to us. All of this is a gift. It all came about because of God. I'm not the one who's actually holding the universe together. It really will not fall apart if I stop working one day a week. All those rhythmic patterns of Sabbath keeping that are meant to be life-giving because they deliver us on a regular basis. It's as though the Old Testament is suggesting we should never be more than 6 days out from laying down every illusion and delusion we might have of our own power. Don't ever let yourself go more than 6 days from laying it all down and remembering none of it is from you. None of it is finally about you. None of it is going to make or ultimately break your life in terms of your work. It just is it's a boundary, but not one that the American church or most churches throughout history have observed very well, but one that I think is meant to be a life-giving thing. So I think that carries with it some degree of metrics that you're describing about how would I know whether I've gone too far? Have I crossed from loyalty and love into supreme allegiance? That's a very different authority.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I think Chris has another question. He raised
Sure.
Yeah. So that question just got me thinking about something you had said earlier, and I hate to be the one that brings up COVID-19, but you had said earlier that the greater danger is false worship and idolatry. What do you see as are some of the ways in which COVID-19 is unmasking some of those greater dangers for us, some of those areas of false worship, false idols?
Right. Well, I think everybody is being exposed to the things that we cling to the most, right? And whether or not we can sustain those things. And there are some things we can sustain in isolation, but there are all kinds of things in our lives, meaningful things, really valuable, important things, not least the presence of other people that we love and that we want to be with, and that we want to celebrate with, or lament with, whatever it might be, or our work, or our money, or our view of our bodies, or our way of entertaining and indulging ourselves, right? All these things are sort of exposed in different ways through the isolation of this moment. And I think it does give us a really fresh way of thinking, okay, let me think again about what this is telling me about why am I so desperate for X or Y or Z, whatever it might be. It's not because it's necessarily wrong to want those things at all. That's not my view. But it may be, interestingly, exposing of the degree to which we're controlled by those things, right? So there are prompts in our daily life that if we have privilege, if we have education, if we have enough financial resources, if we're not subject to abuse, racial prejudice, on the list could go. If we are not bound by those things, then we tend to think we have control to get for ourselves what we want from life. That kind of a narrative, right? That's sort of the whole character of American culture. But what happens when those things are taken away? And then why do we become desperate for certain ones of those? What do they actually mean to us? Have we put too much emphasis and time there? I've been interested in a number of different interviews that I've listened to from people who sometimes they're quite prominent, sometimes they're just, as it were, ordinary citizens on the street, but who have said, it's caused me, honestly, to really rethink the amount of time that I'm spending working to begin with. It's causing me to have to think again about my family. It's causing me to think again about what achievements am I really after, right? All that kind of stuff that has come up. I think that's an interesting moment to then say, yeah, so what is my list? What are the things that at least I should be mindful of? I've sometimes joked that I'm not a gaudy idolater like Nebuchadnezzar with an enormous gold statue that I'm calling people to worship and bow down before. I'm more like a Pottery Barn restoration hardware idolater who has kind of tasteful idols on a shelf in my house that represent, markers of control, ownership, beauty, organization, privilege, really. And I think that those become very interesting to meditate on. What are those things that are on that shelf in our mind, or maybe physically as well? The people, the voices of influence, the need for ... whatever it might be. What is it telling us about ourselves and our worship? Does that make sense, Chris?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of sounds like one of the gifts of exile is the lack of busyness it might bring. And maybe exile for the Israelites would have been more busy in some ways than exile for us might be, right? But that does lead, it sounds like it yields a degree of introspection.
It has a potential of that, but like every opportunity for introspection, we will be more likely than not to crowd it out or let it be crowded out. So one of the spiritual disciplines of exile has to be, okay, right, this is disorienting. How do I seize the meaning of this disorientation rather than how do I plug it or get over it or grin and bear it? How do I, in a way, milk it for all it's worth? How do I try to figure out everything that I can learn about what a time like this can actually offer me? I think that's a very, very different approach. And we may not have expansive time to give attention to that, but if we just deny that whole movement of exile, then I think we have lost one of its main gifts. Yeah, I would agree.
Thank you.
Thank you. And in the absence of other questions at the moment, I will pop in another of my own, unless somebody else has another in mind. Oh, and being cognizant of your time as well. So please let us know when you have to hop off if it's a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'm fine for now.
Great, thank you. I think one thing that this talk about Daniel brought up in my mind is how Daniel was actually able to rise very effectively in power and in recognition in a society so different from him, where the people in power, the people of influence in society, worshipped different things, had different standards, and yet he was effective while still keeping completely to his God, our God. And I think that just reminded me of some recent reading I've been doing on two things. One is, well, not really reading, listening. I was listening to some old Tim Keller sermons on wisdom, and he defined wisdom as the competence to understand the world for what it is and to act effectively within it. So that kind of reminded me of like, okay, what about like in my work, am I able to be truly wise and discerning around people who have very different standards than me, as Daniel was? And the other thing that I was reminded of is Lecrae, who was at the Veritas Forum, so 1 week ago. And he spoke about how he doesn't really want to identify himself as a Christian artist because he wants to master the art itself. And then it'll draw people who may have different values, non-Christian values, to him and to his God. And I guess this isn't a very clear question because it's quite new in my mind, but this idea of like, how do we as Christians become effective in the world and get the ear of people in a society where there's a lot of, different goals and different gods?
Right. Well, what's interesting at the beginning of the book of Daniel, I think that helps me reflect on that question is, clearly Nebuchadnezzar and his other henchmen took the tact that most conquerors have taken over history, which is to attempt to find the best and the brightest, to draw them into an assimilation environment, to train them to fit the new context in order to be able to be used by them to assimilate the rest of their people, right? That's a classic conqueror's strategy. What's interesting, as you point out, is that in the text, there is this strong sense of Daniel and his friends' intelligence, their perception, their deference, and as you say, a wise expression of deference. So they go respectfully to the authorities and say, we'd like to try an experiment. It has to do with our dietary law. We understand that we don't want to put anybody's life in jeopardy. We just would like to try the experiment to demonstrate to you that we can keep the dietary law and be of no less value to you. Now, that's a very interesting distinction, right? So they're willing to say there's a line of difference between eating, as it were, kosher, if you want to call it that. In this case, that's sort of an anachronistic term to apply to this. But anyway, eat kosher. And then, on the other hand, to want to defer and live inside the justifiable expectation that they're not going to drop the ball, that they're not going to be ineffective workers, that they're not going to become sick and vulnerable. They're going to meet the expectations, but they're going to do it in a different way. Could you please give us permission to do that? Now, for Daniel and his friends, nothing could be more profound than eating, as it were, kosher in Nebuchadnezzar's house. I mean, that is the ground of what kept them clear. I don't think chapter 2 and 3 would ever be that if they hadn't practiced remembering who they were, right? So that is part of the wisdom path. So one of the definitions I've used for wisdom is that wisdom is God's truth and character lived in context. And when all of those things are happening, then you have actually wisdom. It's not just truth and character. It's truth and character lived, actually enacted, not just affirmed, and then lived in context. And all of that happens with Daniel and his friends, right? grounded in the truth and character of God. They're living it, which is what they're trying to figure out. And then they're going to do it in the context now of this radically different environment. And if the Church of Jesus Christ around the world, or in our neighborhood, or in our own house, if the people that are followers of Jesus that we know or are seeking to be ourselves, we're people who grounded our lives every day in the truth and character of God being lived in context to the things that we're actually doing, we would have the capacity to demonstrate, I think, this intersection you're describing between the secular and the sacred, if you want to make that division. Interestingly, that's not itself a biblical division, which is why they can do this rather seamlessly, because they realize that Nebuchadnezzar is just a petty power. He's nothing compared to the God who raises and lowers kings, right? So because they see all that so clearly and seamlessly, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't distract them, but they have no reason, therefore, to not, as it were, play along with Nebuchadnezzar's game, if that's the way that he wants to play it. So if you go through these chapters more carefully and with greater detail than we had time for today, you'll just see evidence after evidence of what you're describing. And I think it is one of the most beneficial parts of learning how to walk in that space. This is why I've felt for some years, really, that for a long time, kind of mainline Protestantism in America existed in what you might say in the center of the block, right? A classic mainline building that represents a role in mainline culture. But now I would say, the question is not whether the church is there. The question is the church in the intersections? Is the church able to show up in the cross paths life and world that we all occupy, in collision and diversion and danger and uncertainty and on the move? Are we able to show up and add the value of the kingdom of God into that intersection? That's, I think, our vocation. That's why exilic life is, to me, so valuable to reflect on, because, in fact, whether we use that label or think about it in those terms or not, we are actually all living an exilic life. And we've either decided to just conform, or we've decided to actually be an agent of transformation. And obviously, Daniel and his friends are trying to do the latter.
Thank you. Really helpful. I think we have 2 more questions coming up, if that's all right.
Sure.
Thank you. One from Anna, and then one from Kevin. So Anna, do you want to go first?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Wow, this is just amazing. Thank you so much. I am very fascinated by something you said earlier. You called sin disordered love, or something to that effect.
Right.
Can you unpack that a little bit? Just expand on what you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, it's a phrase that unfortunately does not find its origin with me, but with St. Augustine. And his idea of that was that love gets inverted and wrongly ordered. So we're made to love God first and to let all other loves fall in place underneath that, in light of that, right? And then we're meant to love ourselves. We're meant to love our neighbor. And if we love ourselves first, if we love our neighbor first, if we fail to love God at all, then we are living in a world of disordered loves, and we give the wrong priority to the wrong things or the wrong people. And I think the challenge of that is that it puts us in a circumstance where, sorry, did I lose you there for a minute? It puts us in a circumstance where we're trying to sort out a problem that we don't even really know we have. We feel, for example, the disappointment of other people not being able to love us, or us not being able to love other people. And we think, well, then we just have to love harder. Well, yeah, that's probably true, but the Bible's answer to that is different. The Bible's answer is, if you're trying to solve the question of love in your life by loving only on the human plane, then you're not actually either receiving or able to give a love for which you were actually created. We were designed to love God first as the most supreme act of love in our lives, to let all love be defined by the reality of God's love. This is why the ministry and witness of Jesus is so profound. If we want to get our loves sorted out, watch the loves of Jesus. And Jesus's love is always first and foremost for God the Father. And it's not for himself or getting his disciples to fawn after him or getting them to fawn after each other or to fawn after Rome, especially. So instead, it's like, let's get first things first. And the first of first things is the love of God. If that's really the place that we put our first dependency, not how does my spouse or my good friends or my family demonstrate that I'm loved, but do I have as a fundamental rock in my life the faithfulness and love of a merciful and generous and kind God? That takes enormous pressure off of relationships with other people. I'm not expecting you to be my God. I'm not expecting you to love me perfectly. I'm not expecting you to know what I've never spoken, but I just think because I'm needy enough that you should just be able to read my life and know what I want and need, right? All these things that we inflict on our neighbors because we have disordered love. We're expecting something of our neighbors which could never be given by them, nor can we give it to them, right? Either way. That's a first order love. That is really why a personal knowledge of God is meant to be the grounding of our life. So in identity terms, it means I don't try to work out my identity through the lens of my work. My work is meant to be my work. I get to do it with every gift that God may give me, with success or with failure, with fame or with no attention whatsoever. And because I'm only expecting of my work something that's appropriate to my work, I don't expect to love my work in order to satisfy the loves of my life. This is where achievement can become so twisted, right? Where performance, especially in elite contexts, can be so distorting because we actually give ourselves to earn the love of the institution or the supervisor or the journal or the publisher or whoever it may be. And in the process of that, we lose our way in a way that is just, it's a tragic loss of our life. I remember once talking to a junior but a super high achieving young professor at Cal, and he came in and he said, you know, I've been attending here now for several months. I wanted to come in and talk to you because I have a problem, but it's not the problem that I think others might bring to you. I don't bring to you the problem of not having achieved. I bring you the problem of having gotten everything I've ever wanted to achieve, and early success and early tenure and you know, all the success that he could have. And he says, but I have no idea why I exist. I have no idea why my life or my achievements even matter. I'm without any clue because I've given myself to something that simply can't answer that question. This has only just recently dawned on me, he said, that I've been asking my major life question of in the wrong places. So I hope that clears up what I think is meant by that phrase.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And Kevin, I think you're up next.
Yeah, see if I can frame this. I've been wrestling recently with whether or not I should be, as a person of faith, be pushing back against some of the medical advice that we are getting about isolating ourselves. Mm-hmm. In the sense that I see bereaved folks talking about how they wonder if their relative might have had a greater will to live if their family had been allowed to be present. Or clergy in England protesting about not being allowed to minister to the sick and dying, that they've been cut out of the medical community that is able to take that risk. And then seeing Dr. Fauci saying he thought it was a good thing if we never shook hands again, if we never hugged anyone again, right? And I'm thinking of Jesus reaching out and touching the leper, right? And you know, some of the extraordinary things that the early church did in those plagues and stuff, right? And wondering at what point do we say, well, this makes perfect medical sense, but on the other hand, you know, what do I do as a believer?
Right. Yeah, it's a really, really great question, Kevin. Of course, all these questions have been very stimulating. I think I would first distinguish between structural love and interpersonal love. So when it comes, for example, to my view, at least, of churches meeting in enclosed spaces for worship, I would say, no, I don't see any justifiable reason for that. I would draw that line, I suppose, on the grounds that that it's not me, it's not about my rights to worship. It's about my potentially injuring the person that I might be near as a result of it. So my understanding of isolation is principally about my loving my neighbor by not being present closer than 6 feet. That's sort of an assumption. But that feels really quite different to me than the deeply interpersonal issues that you're describing. And it's clear that our hospitals, which has been the main example, I think, that I would use for what you're describing, the sense of people being left to die alone because of the danger of the virus, that feels very questionable to me. And I think it's questionable within families. I think it's questionable within a number of other contexts, like clergy being able to administer last rites in a Roman Catholic sense, or at least to be with people who are grieving, either family or friends. Now, I don't think we are very practiced at doing this. I think we can easily be prone to underestimate the power of disease, and we really can go in as though we think we can do this good act and be impermeable. I don't know that people are really serious about realizing that they're mortal. This is one of the great gifts of chapter 3 of Daniel. They say, we might die. That's fine. We're not going to worship the golden statue that you have set up. So I agree that there is a place for Christian conscience to push back. And I think it has to be done wisely and discerningly. And unfortunately, I wouldn't use those words largely to describe the American church. I don't think it's wise or particularly discerning. If it was wise and discerning, I would feel better about really affirming taking appropriate risk and realizing that there could be consequences, and certainly going in, I think, legitimately protected, but not being absent, right? Letting people, your loved ones, hear your voices and all those things that I've done with hundreds and hundreds of people in the process of their dying. And if I was serving in a pastoral role or had an occasion to be in a relationship with someone who was dying of COVID, that I should be the person to go and see them, I would want to go see them, and I wouldn't want to not go see them. I think I would be willing, I will say, donning appropriate garb, but being present at that moment, and not, and our hospitals are secular institutions. They're not set up to handle the ministry of the plagues that you're referring to, right? They have bureaucracies and ethics committees and many other shields against vulnerability. And I do think in a quite genuine and humble sense, not in a power-centric way, that we can offer our lives in that ministry as a faithful act as a disciple. I don't think we're compelled to do that, but I think we are legitimized in doing that in a way that should often be, I think, against the practices of our government, for example. Does that distinction make sense to you, or does that seem too boundary as well?
No, in fact, I mean, I have quoted myself, one of the Puritan theologians who said, when the magistrate tells you not to meet on the Sabbath because of the danger of plague, that we should obey. And he says, for one thing, he says, we have to remember that, the man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. But I think the thing that bothers me the most is the idea that this should not be temporary, but going forward, that we should be lessening human contact.
Yes. Well, I don't know, Dr. Fauci, but I once was invited into a setting at the UCSF, to spend 3 days with the deans of the medical school as they were recrafting the medical school curriculum. And they wanted me as a theologian to talk to them about the meaning of human life and about what quote, treatment of a person means, as opposed to treatment of a body or of mere biochemistry. And though it was a fascinating conversation, and we had several really interesting days together. But eventually, one of the primary dean of UCSF was trying to see if there could be convergence within the other deans around the idea of treating a person, and there wasn't. They were unable to agree, and the people that were on the medical side simply wanted to treat biochemistry, and they did not have an interest in treating a person, and they certainly did not have an interest in anything relational about the medical personnel and the person being treated. It was really one of the most stark examples of the secularization of caregiving I'd ever actually. And I think it underscores what you're describing. I can't imagine that Dr. Fauci wasn't. I mean, if you're an epidemiologist of his rank, you have had a whole lot more exposure to the materialist vision than to a spiritual vision. Now, I know that he claims to be a Christian believer. I'm not really denying. I mean, a believer in God, at least. I know that he and Francis Collins are very close friends. They talk every night. I'm sure Francis Collins's view and Dr. Fauci's view on a permanent end to hugging or handshaking would not be Francis Collins' vision.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such an important question for the times, I think, both in terms of our personal lives and what we're seeing in the news and politics.
Right.
I guess, does anybody else have a question coming up? I also just want to be really fully aware of your time.
Yeah, I'm probably getting close to needing to go. Let me just say how grateful I am for all of you. Kevin has given me the chance in the past to speak to combinations of people at MIT and Harvard and faculty as well as students. And I'm just so grateful for Kevin, and I'm so grateful for the ministry that the grad fellowship has. And I really believe in the privilege of your context, as I did for many years, both in my own studies in England and also in working with students at Cal. These are amazingly privileged settings. And when you, my prayer in leaving is that all of you would be, some version of faithful exile, both in the places that you're studying and as you go on in your work and future. It's that combination that is the anointed gift that God has given you through the gifts and abilities and education that you've had up to now, and the formation that's happened. And the world desperately needs people of the most supreme kind of intellectual and reflective capacities and creative arts in whatever form or discipline that might be, combined with a deep formation of personal character and vision that is free and uncontrolled by, in the dominant sense, uncontrolled by the environment, so that you are a free agent in the space in which you're going to live and work, and not be captive to the university or to success or fame or power or all the things that can be, as Daniel so vividly points out, be our life's great distraction. So I'm just grateful for the chance to be with you. And can I offer a prayer? I'm sure you're going to go on with other things, but I'd like to pray for you all.
Love that.
Please.
Lord, I'm very, very grateful for each of these that have been on the call, for the questions and the challenges that we face. We all are in exilic places, and it's internal, it's public, it's professional, it's educational, spiritual. We need you, oh God, to be the one who grounds us in exile, that helps us to remember our identity at the very core, that allows us to be both oriented even in the midst of being disoriented. And we pray for a willingness to trust you boldly for things that only you can do. I do think in this time, there are ways that you may want to move. I know I've prayed, and many have prayed for a sensitivity to be able to discern how you would want us to step toward this time and not away from it. And that you want to give us a clear vision about the things that matter most and what's really on the line. Help us to keep clear about those things so that we can bring to this moment and any other moments of our life the reality of your presence and love. So thank you, oh God, for your goodness. Thank you for this fellowship. Bless all the students. Bless Kevin and all those in the team that coordinates these gatherings. Use even this time as a time of rich encouragement and hope. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.